I'm beginning now a regular feature of our Shabbat morning, 10 minutes on some random thought about Torah, how to study Torah, etc. And I wanted to share with you one of the skills I had to teach my students at the Academy for Jewish Religion. I was a co-founder with Rabbi Stan Levy and Rabbi Stephen Robbins. And we had a wonderful group of people who came to study with us, many of them already acting as rabbis in canons and congregation throughout the western United States and even some places beyond. And many of them self-educated and had a plethora of knowledge of many, many books. And they had decent Hebrew. But here's one thing I found when they would come to my classes is they had not learned a very basic skill on how to read a holy text in general and the Bible in particular. So I'm going to call this beginner mind. Whenever you come to a holy text, and this will require a little bit of capacity in Hebrew, which is not hard, and that's one thing we'll be presenting on our array of classes, is how to read and understand basic Hebrew. That's going to be coming up this summer. We begin with what I was trained to call philology, which is love of words, but it really means is paying attention to specific words. So what do you do in Hebrew? You have to know the root of the word. For example, to learn is lamad. You have to learn the different variations of the word. For example, Talmud, which is learning. Lelamed, to teach. And then you have to know the various grammatical forms. So you start with the meaning of the word as much as it can be captured. Now, here's the problem, that what many people do is when they look at a word, if they're learned, they know what Rashi says, our greatest biblical interpreter, who lived from 1065 and to early in the 1100s. Or they know the Midrash, or they know the Talmud. So many people don't read the word fresh. They read it through a lens of a history of interpretation, which is not a bad thing. But one thing I taught my students to do was go on something like an archaeological dig, which means try to go to the philological meaning in the Bible as well as it can be recovered. And with the books we have out today, that's actually possible. And there are some websites. For example, I think Bible Hub. You can pick a translation, you hover over the word, and you can click, and it goes down to the Brown Driver Briggs Biblical Dictionary. It goes down to a concordance. It's either Bible Gateway or Bible Hub, which one of the two. I used it constantly, especially when I'm working with a language that I don't know. So, for example, when I'm studying New Testament, I go to look down at the range of meanings of Greek words. What a great way for me to learn New Testament, because I can read the Greek letters, but I really don't know the language very well. But with Bible Hub, Bible Gateway, I can go down into the actual etymology of the word. So start with beginner mind. I don't know what this word means. I'm not going to take any theological positions. I'm not going to read it through the lens of tradition. Oh, by the way, I want to share with you. I saw a little debate going on online, and I went to a passage in the New Testament that people were quoting about Jesus's the Virgin Mary birthing Jesus. I was able to go to the New Testament passage under discussion. I went to the website where I could look actually into the actual Greek words used. I looked them up one by one, and I realized the translation had almost nothing to do with the meaning of the actual Greek words, which means the translator translated theologically and put a theological lens on the verse, not sustainable about what the actual Greek said. Now, when I raised this on the website, nobody who knew Greek contested what I had said, and it was a really interesting thing of what it means to read a text through the lens of tradition and what it means to read a text with an attention to actually what the words mean in their basic meaning, and I do believe that words have basic meanings. The next way you have to study is what I would call, and this really disturbed my students, is understanding basic grammar, what we call syntax, which means how groups of words are used to create meaningful units. So sometimes when a student would translate a passage, I would say subject, verb, predicate, adjective, adverb. Now, why do I know how to do that? Because I had a great teacher in 7th grade who taught us how to analyze words in English, which we had to do trees: subject, object, adjective, adverb. And what an amazing introduction to the nature of language as language tries to create meaning. Well, you have to start with the meaning of words, philology, then how words are arranged to create meaning, and then only when that's done, go to what I call the semantics, which means what kind of meaning has been arranged by these words in this sentence, in this order, with these adjectives, these adverbs, and you might actually say to what purpose, what kind of meaning is trying to be created. Now, this is very difficult if your study of, for example, Scripture has only been done in the lens of Rashi or the Midrash or the Talmud. It's as if you can't come to the text with beginner mind. Just 2 steps after that. Then I would ask my students, when we got to the semantic, what kind of meanings are being suggested. I would call it the range of meanings. And this is a term you used. I learned mostly with studying theory of language when I was in college, that properly speaking, there's a difference between what the word means and what I mean. When I say I mean something, I'm using words to communicate something from myself. But when I ask what the word means, I have to distinguish between what I mean and what the word means. And so how do words mean? So one thing we realize is words have a range of meanings. And therefore, when you read a word in its syntactical unit, meaning how you construct a sentence, its semantic mention, what meaning's being conveyed, what you have to realize is there's a range of meanings with words and therefore in sentences. So when you read a sentence, you realize there's a range of meanings. And again, a problem with reading text theologically or through the tradition is the range of meanings has been decided for you. And to read with beginner mind, you have to realize, you have to ask yourself, what is the range of meanings possible? Now, from that, you can then actually read it what I would call theologically, which means, is it communicating something about the divine? A last thing I want to say right now is to read the sentences as a sense of a literary unit. Take all back to the verses Abigail read this morning, the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verses 13 to 18. As you go through each of the verses from 13 to 18, let's see, I think I have it in front of me very briefly. Do not cheat, do not rob, do not withhold a worker's wage. Don't curse the deaf, place a stumbling block before the blind, revere God. Meaning these are things that are only known to you and God. No one could prove this on the outside, what your intentions were. Do not commit perversion of justice, don't favor the poor or honor the great. With righteousness you shall judge. On and on and on. And the end it says, love your neighbor as yourself. Now we don't know what that means. Those words are just somewhat opaque in Hebrew. You shall love your rea, your neighbor, your kinsfolk, people in your village. Kamocha, that could mean as you want to be loved, or see them as yourself, that they are a subject just as you are a subject. There's many fine interpretations. But one thing you have to realize is that phrase is rather opaque, and I think intentionally opaque. It's not opaque because the writer didn't know how to write. It's opaque because it's poetic. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is, love your neighbor as yourself is the crown of a series of sentences. So then you would read it backwards. Love your neighbor as yourself, whatever that means. Well, how do you do that? Then you go backwards. Then you would say, don't bear a grudge, don't take revenge, surely rebuke your neighbor, don't hate your brother in your heart. So what you realize, if you start at the end and go backwards, what the foregoing is a theory of how to love your neighbor. And that's where you have to read sections of the Bible, for example, as literary units, which answers a very basic question. Why does the beginning of Genesis describe God creating the world in 6 days? Why 6? Because the 7th day is the Sabbath. That's why 6 days. is not making a statement about the cosmos, about the origins of the universe. That is not on the mind of the author, the poetic author of Genesis chapter 1. What's on their mind is, where does the Sabbath come from? What does a Sabbath mean? So try to imagine when you're reading Genesis 1 that you start with, this author is heading toward a theory of the Sabbath. Let me work backwards. So when we study scripture with beginner mind, remember, we're ignoring Rashi, we're ignoring the tradition for now. I'm not saying it's not worthwhile studying Rashi. I study Rashi, I study the Talmud, the Midrash, all of those. But I begin with, forget what they say. Let me do my own homework. I want to understand what the words mean, how they're arranged into units, for example, syntax, semantics, what meanings are being created. Is there a theological dimension, a spiritual dimension, an inner life dimension? And then I want to see it as a literary unit. And how does all of this create a literary unit? Remembering that meanings have a range, not a definition. So I'll be teaching a lot more on how to read the Bible, especially with some wonderful websites that can take you right down to a grammatical analysis. You'll have to learn how to read Hebrew, which does not take more than a few days. And the Bible will open up to you, and you will find that you are in charge of how the Bible creates meaning. And then you can study Rashi, Talmud, Midrash, and the tradition. But I think we really have to start with mastering how the Bible makes meaning as students of the Bible. Okay? That's my 10 minutes of Torah for today.